Well, I think it's really important that we learn the lessons of COVID, and that's why the inquiry was established. And we want to make sure that whatever lessons there are to be learned are learned, and we do that in a spirit of transparency and candour. The government has cooperated with the inquiry. Tens of thousands of documents have been handed over. And with regard to the specific question at the moment, the government's carefully considering its position, but it's confident in the approach that it's taken.
Are you prepared to get into a legal battle with a public inquiry? Some senior legal figures think you'll lose that fight.
Again, not going to comment on the speculation, but we are carefully considering next steps, and the government is confident in its position.
Are you saying that it should be up to ministers to decide what documents are looked at by the inquiry, not the independent judge in charge of it?
Again, government's handed over tens and tens of thousands of documents in a spirit of candour and transparency, because it is important that we learn the lessons of COVID. With regard to the particular question at the moment, we're carefully considering next steps, but the government is confident in its position.
So you might not hand over that material that they're asking for then?
Again, as I said, government is considering next steps carefully, but has been confident in its position, has handed over tens of thousands of documents.
Not all the documents that they've asked.
Tens of thousands of documents today in a spirit of candour and transparency, because it's important that we learn the lessons from COVID, and again, carefully considering next steps.
Right, well, live to Westminster, and our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen. Tamara, let's begin with what they want handed over and why.
Well, we've had a new twist in this row about what the government is handing over to the COVID inquiry. We had a deadline of 4 p.m. today for the government to comply with a request to hand over Boris Johnson's WhatsApps covering a period of 2 years from 2020 to 2022, the height of the COVID crisis, and also some handwritten notes that he had been taken, 24 handwritten notebooks during this period. The COVID inquiry set up by the government has quite wide legal powers to demand material, and Lady Hallett, who chairs that inquiry, said it was relevant. If the government didn't want to hand it over and the Cabinet Office had said some of it was irrelevant, then they would have to take legal action. It would all end up in court. Now, what we've seen in the last few moments is the COVID inquiry have extended that deadline from 4 p.m. today to 4 p.m. Thursday, but also said they've been told by the Cabinet Office, this is Boris Johnson in the US being caught up with by our journalist James Matthews. What they've now said is that the Cabinet Office don't actually have any of this stuff. They don't have Boris Johnson's WhatsApps or his diaries. So that certainly raises a few questions, because a couple of weeks ago, when they were arguing to the inquiry that they shouldn't have to disclose it all, they just said in there that some of it might not be relevant, some of it might concern other subjects. And Lady Hallett, the chair of the inquiry, gave that quite short shrift and said that she should be able to look through it. So they don't have it. I understand Boris Johnson's team don't believe they've actually been asked in writing for any of it, although they say that he is willing to disclose information to the COVID inquiry, but it's up to the Cabinet Office in what form that happens. Now, many legal figures don't expect the government would have much chance of getting out of disclosing these materials. We spoke to the Labour peer and former Lord Chancellor, Lord Faulkner, and this is what he told us this morning.
I don't think the government have got a leg to stand on. There seem to me to be a number of issues here. First of all, the chair, who's a very distinguished ex-judge, is saying, I decide what's relevant, not you, to the government, and that's obviously right. Then the government is saying, but hold on, some of this stuff has got nothing to do with COVID at all. What happens if ministers are exchanging WhatsApp messages either about their personal life or about some completely different issue, say Ukraine, to which Baroness Hallett has said, well, one of the things I'm investigating, and you've asked me, the government, to investigate this, is how you took decisions. There's a big issue, she says, as to whether or not the Prime Minister was sufficiently focused on COVID throughout the period he was making decisions. So I want to see what else was going on.
So that's the case for Lady Hallett seeing this material. We now have some apparently missing WhatsApp messages and handwritten diaries from Boris Johnson during the crucial period, and another 2 days to find out if the government has made much effort to get hold of them and whether they intend to hand them over to the COVID inquiry. We are awaiting a response from the Cabinet Office to that latest development from the inquiry.